Well, thank you, Ron, and thank you, Christine. Um, Hurricane Katrina in 2005 was the largest natural disaster in the history of this country, taking almost 2,000 lives. And it looms large in our collective consciousness. In the recent earthquake in Haiti, by comparison, up to 230,000 people died, with some 300,000 injured and an estimated 1 million left homeless. Now, these were each natural disasters, and yet the chaos and the death tolls that ensued reflected not just the destructiveness of nature, but the social and historical legacy, in each case tied up with slavery, that rendered the people of both New Orleans and Haiti so very vulnerable. Well, today, and this is in part at Gail Williams' suggestion, we depart from our usual format to present a panel discussion on Haiti with two of my prominent Vanderbilt colleagues and the current visiting fellow at our Humanities Center, herself a Haitian American, Jemima Pierre. So let me briefly introduce all three of our panelists. Colin, Dayan is the Robert Penn Warren Professor in the Humanities at Vanderbilt. She works on Caribbean social history and literature, especially Haiti and Jamaica, on early American religious and legal history of the Americas, on 19th century American, French, and English literary history, and African American studies and American studies. Her book, Haiti, History and the Gods, brings history, literature, and religion into dialogue through an examination of Haitian historiography and voodoo. Her recent book, The Story of Cruel and Unusual, from MIT in 2007, gives a legal history of the worst excesses of the current war, continuing war on terror. And I think it's her latest book from Princeton, but I can't keep up with her publication rate here. The Law is a White Dog, shows how the rituals of law make and unmake persons. Colin's been an active commentator on Haiti's current plight, with PBS NewsHour interviews, Should the US Change Policy on Haiti, where she argues for debt relief, and a recent article in the Boston Review, Civilizing, in scare quotes, Haiti. Second, Jane Landers, Associate Professor of History at Vanderbilt. She's been director of our Center for Latin American and Iberian Studies. She teaches courses in Latin American colonial history, Atlantic, world history, history of gender and women in colonial Latin America, and comparative slave systems. She's the author of Black Society in Spanish Florida, co-author of The Atlantic World, 1400 to 1888, and she's edited or co-edited 3 other books on colonial slavery. Jemima Pierre is the William S. Vaughan Visiting Fellow at Vanderbilt's Robert Penn Warren Center for the Humanities and an Assistant Professor of Anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin. She was part of a delegation to Haiti only days after the earthquake and contributed to an important article last month in The Nation, How to Help Haiti. Her current book project, I think it's still current unless it's changed its mind, Racial Americanization, Conceptualizing African Immigrants in the US, is an ethnographic examination of how post-colonial Africans as black immigrants are negotiating the dynamics of life in a society structured by changing processes of racialization. Now, before we ask Colin to kick us off, I should say that if you feel moved to contribute to Haitian relief in one form or other, if you log on to the website that you use to book your meal today, you can find, or you will be able to find shortly, some suggestions as to places that you could contribute money to. Colin, can we start you off?
Thank you, David. Can you hear me? Great. I'm glad to be here today, and what I'd like to do is offer this as a prelude, a series of questions that are haunted by the themes of exterminating violence. These questions demand both our response and our responsibility. The title of the talk, I should warn you, is Haiti, or What is a Metaphor for? In their coverage of the earthquake, the media represented Haiti as a victim, a passive object of disaster. No history, no culture, nothing, and I'm sure you remember this, except images of rubble, pain, dirt, and misery. How did the news dare to show piles of bodies being bulldozed into graves and focus on women in postures that could only be called abject? Today I'd like to ask with you, what do the representations of Haiti tell us about the force of metaphor? And why are these metaphors so crucial to North Americans? What is a metaphor for? Showing images when dealing with a country like Haiti, alternately sentimentalized and brutalized, is a dangerous business. It risks succumbing to the language of Haitian exceptionalism. That is, Haiti as radically unlike any other place, as grotesquely unique. But we must remember that both processes, whether idealization or degradation, displace the human element. We face a process of sublimation, up or down. So amid evocations of a desperate people or a festering landscape, the media and the humanitarian community continue to ignore the history and culture of Haiti. Through stereotypes and sensationalism, the media have created an image of Haiti, I want to argue, that suits powerful outside states and their financial interests. Generalizations about criminality and repression of the peasantry became more violent than usual, always in Haitian history, due to the necessities of export, the appropriation of lands, or the use of captive wage labor in multinational assembly industries. Whenever this kind of commercial need became necessary, voodoo practices especially would be described as superstition and black magic. A mythologized Haiti of zombies and witch doctors screens the ongoing greed, color prejudice, political guile, and the sheer weight of military force. Every text about Haiti has a context, also a subtext and a pretext. With Haiti, it has always been about representation. How Haiti is perceived, written about, shaped the destiny of the nation. And representation has a dual meaning, to depict and to present again. People usually depict and represent things for more or less specific purposes, literary, political, historical. On one hand, representation is necessary to think and to talk about what is real, what already exists, as well as to act on it, as with cultural constructs, race, class, or gender. But on the other hand, representation is contestable. All representations are partial. They only depict and present again parts of those meaningful units and relations, building blocks of reality. Clearly then, representation, literal or metaphorical, involves appropriation. Now, I'm arguing today that representations of Haiti have been and are largely negative. They entail violation of the integrity of the thing represented. The facts of history disappear in fantasies of the unspeakable. The unthinkable revolution of slaves, the threatening spectacle of voodoo, which is most often used by outsiders to signal the backwardness and indolence that they feel best describe Haitian history. To serve the gods, however, is to be obsessed with details and fragments, inspired by the very things that might seem to hinder belief. This sense of invention, goaded by thought, leads me to emphasize that voodoo practices should be viewed as ritual reenactments of Haitian history, a recasting of the customs, laws, and tortures of a very bad history committed by a brute neo-colonial world. Voodoo is never static. It adapts itself to the quirks of history and the drive of capital. It combines African belief, Catholic practices, and even the newest objects of consumption. The appearance of the gods, even the cult of the dead, thus guarantees a political history that is rigorous and visible. So, again, I ask, how political is the continued deformation of Haitian culture, the maligning, for example, of this distinctive practice? In Haiti, material dispossession has always gone hand in hand with cultural domination. A crucial reciprocity, and it's so important to remember this, exists between voodoo and the working of the land. The participatory nature of the religion is paralleled in the kumbit, the traditional shared harvesting, the kind of communal effort and grassroots successes seen after the earthquake, though not often visible in our media representations. The land and the loi, the gods or spirits of voodoo, give the majority of Haitians their identity. The kumbit and voodoo alike operate as support networks of beliefs, ceremonies, and friends. So oppression has always proceeded as a double deprivation of property and psyche. In his discourse on colonialism some 60 years ago now, the poet and playwright Aimé Césaire, who died in 2008, opposed the false ideal of modernity to his own awareness of violation. They talked to me about progress, about achievements, illnesses cured, improved standards of living. I'm talking about societies emptied of their soul, of cultures trampled down, of institutions undermined, of lands seized, of religions crushed, of artistic splendors annihilated, of extraordinary possibilities obliterated. Césaire was quick to recognize a tradition of colonization that renatures a country by obliterating its past. How then to speak about Haiti? It remains the place where the contradictions of colonialism, the horrors of occupation, and the truths of resistance can be seen clearly as if under a microscope. Haiti, site of the largest slave revolt in the history of the world, and the only one that succeeded, was the earliest testing ground for capitalist power. Saint-Domingue was the richest French colony in the New World, with a trade that far outstripped that of the 13 North American colonies throughout the 18th century. As the anthropologist Sidney Mintz told us nearly 30 years ago, Haiti was being force-fit into the First World before anything called a Third World ever existed. Now, outside forces have long had something to gain from Haiti. But I want most now to perhaps reflect on what we might do, how we might, as interpreters, begin to think about Haiti. The story of Haiti must be told by standing with our backs to moral injunction, reasonable consensus, our secular ideals of progress. In a terrain ravaged by greed and portrayed as pitiable, let us recognize something like grace, the intense art of ritual and survival against the odds, and beyond the laws or rational expectations of humanist culture. When history turns into nothing more than a metaphor, as powerful as it is empty, rationales of violence become a mandate for the subjugation of a population stigmatized as lawless, primitive, and superfluous. But if Haiti is a metaphor for all kinds of things, degradation, demons, destruction, and dirt, all of them representations of what is antithetical to our treasured Western notions of culture and civility. But do I really mean Western? Where does Haiti sit, after all? We have to ask, what is this metaphor a metaphor for? A metaphor is a representation, but it is always and necessarily a representation in the service of something else, something larger than itself. So too with Haiti. Precisely because a metaphor, as distinct from a simile, is a representation, it contains, it represents, it actually is a falsity. A metaphor is, by definition, not the thing it represents. What it stands for is, by definition, not it. The dirt and the degradation and the destruction, even now, and the demons, are not Haiti. If Haiti is a metaphor, then what is it a metaphor for? Not what does it represent or what is it a representation of, but what does this representation exist for? What does it exist in order to do? Why does it exist at all? In good dialectical form, it exists in the service of our cherished ideal of civilization, which are, of course, notions of self. Our selfhood is mirrored, as in a distorting mirror, in our notions of Haiti. The metaphor exists as the long, sorry story of its genesis and historical development demonstrates, to serve a purpose. And that purpose is connected with and deeply rooted in our notions of self and identity, which means also our notions of the other. Blackness, black freedom, black political independence, black cultural expression and specificity, all these are fundamental notions, and all are represented, not metaphorically, but really in Haiti. Yet fear, contempt, and hostility to this blackness all come to expression in the way we formulate our metaphors. If Haiti stands as a metaphor for misery, for helplessness, then outsiders can assume that such a nation needs the United States to save it. Though the particulars of history prove otherwise, the capacious and constantly shifting uses of metaphor bring us to that critical point where compassion becomes pity, taking care of people who cannot take care of themselves. What remains certain here is that narratives of protection are conducted by the free in the name of the bound, or to put it another way, definitions are in the hands of the definers. Thank you.
Colin's a hard act to follow. I enjoyed that. Thank you, David, for having us, and all of you for coming out today. My task, since I'm the historian in the bunch, is to set up the history a little bit. But I was struck as I heard Colin's fine paper about how many of the images that she was talking about today and how many of the representations are the same as I read in the 18th century materials that I work in. The ideas of being in, having no possibility for civilization, the idea of being backward, all of those are things that were created, those images, long before the present day disasters. And so a little bit about the background to see how this is all set up historically as well, and yet how linked we are in the histories to Haiti. As Colin mentioned, you know, at one point there was quite a glorious civilization present, although it was a French civilization in Haiti in the 18th century. They called Haiti, or Saint-Domingue, as it was known then, at the Pearl of the Antilles. It was the wealthiest colony anyone had in the whole of the Western world, and it produced most of the trade that France had to conduct. It had beautiful libraries, it had museums, it had gardens, it had plantations, and that's the source of the misery that we see today. There were over 8,000 plantations by the middle of the 18th century, cotton, indigo, sugar primarily, and the whole north coast was sugar, and this whole north coast became the African coast of Saint-Domingue. And so the south part that we're most concerned with today was actually less destroyed by the Saint-Domingue Revolution than other parts. But at that top part, the northern plains, by the 18th century, there was a third of the population there had just recently been imported from the area known as Congo and Angola, the central western African nations. And so that's the source of the rich cultural tradition Colin mentioned in Vaudou. If you think of that area as becoming rapidly African, these images of the lack of civilization, the fear of the uncivil, the fear of the superstition that they perceived voodoo to be, was very, very strong in the 18th century. And so those images permeated all of the Western press, and I think they've never disappeared. And then, when in 1791 the slaves finally had enough of their misery and rose against that oppression, all of the images of violence, of barbarity, all of those were made real to the Westerners, at least. So 1791 is an era of revolution, actually. The American Revolution had already happened. Many of the free people of color in Saint-Domingue had participated in our American Revolution. They had gone to Savannah. They had fought for our liberty, and liberty was something everybody wanted. And how do you do that when there is a huge population of enslaved people living in such poverty and misery? So the ideas of liberty were contagious. They came back to Saint-Domingue, and the slaves took it up. And as the earthquake was happening, I happened to be talking about, I was going to do a PowerPoint for you, but we couldn't do it today because of this setup. So I only have one little image, but this is the man, Georges Biassou, who was one of the early leaders of the revolt and left us a long and rich tradition of written materials that we can talk about. His ideas of political rights, of liberty, the idea that he had to make a constitution, all of these sorts of things go against the idea that people cannot be civil, cannot be brought into the Western world. And so we need to remember that as plains are being burned, as plantations are turned to ash, people were also talking about political ideas and liberty. They were writing constitutions, and they were debating all of the ideas of the Western world about the rights of man, for instance, and including those in their documents. And one of the interesting things that Georges Biassou wrote at the beginning, I began the war almost without arms, without munitions, without supplies, and almost without resources on August 23rd, 1791, a time that will always be remembered among the most magnificent of the universe. Now, this is a man who was raised as a slave on those very plantations in the North Plain, and who had absorbed these ideas and thought of himself as the center of the universe, and with glorious ideas about political rights that he was going to bring to reality. Unfortunately, all of the main forces of the Western world worked against that idea. So Spain, England, and France all went to Saint-Domingue to put down this idea of slave revolution. And it took many years of horrible fighting before the revolution was destroyed eventually. In that period, this man, Georges Biassou, and Toussaint Louverture, who was his aide, and Jean-François, another of the triad, all took arms for Spain, who offered them the best deal among the French, the English, and the Spanish. They chose the Spanish offer because the Spanish had often had a much more liberal idea about racial systems and about political rights for people of color. And so for 3 years, they fought for the Spanish before a treaty finally ended it, and they are dispersed around the world where people follow them today. And so the reason that he appears today and that we have some images of him is because of the treaty with the Spanish. He lived in St. Augustine, Florida, and you can visit his home there. The Haitian American Historical Association is trying to memorialize him as they memorialize the people that fought at Savannah. And so the Haitian history of a different sort is available to us in our very own country, but not many people know about it. One of the interesting things, too, about the ideas of the rebels was that they were looking at other constitutional possibilities and looking for things that might serve their purposes in their constitutions. They tried several times to negotiate a liberty for themselves and just their families, and that was rejected, and pretty soon they said, we're taking it to the maximum and we want everybody free. And one of the very interesting declarations that Biassou makes as he's fighting these Europeans for control of the country is talking about justice and who did what for the riches that they had extracted so long from that country. And I think it speaks to some of the same ideas that Colin was talking about, and it speaks to the idea that they saw injustice and were going to remedy it one way or the other. They decided that their justice and their equality would be against the avaricious whites who had oppressed them. They demanded general liberty and a general amnesty for everybody that had fought, this time not just for their families, but for everybody. And they said 480,000 individuals who allow you to enjoy all you possess. And they flipped the racial stereotypes that Colin was talking about on their head when they said that the white planters of the island exercised dominion not by any other right, quote, except that you are stronger and more barbaric than we. And they continued, all being children of the same Father, created in the same image. We are your equals then by natural right. And so you can see they had been reading all of the wonderful declarations of our independence, of the French as well. And he said, have you not sworn to uphold the French Constitution? Have you forgotten that you formally vowed the Declaration of the Rights of Man? And it closed, here, gentlemen, is the request of men who are like you, and here is their final resolution. They are resolved to live free or die. And this was written very early on in the fight for independence of Haiti. Until now, we never knew that a real constitution existed for Haiti. We knew that one was written in 1804. But nobody ever had found a copy of it. And you may have seen in the New York Times recently a wonderfully lucky and hardworking young graduate student found a copy of the final constitution that declared independence of Haiti in 1804 and located it in the archives in France. And at the very end of that declaration, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who ends up being the one who finally brings us to freedom in Haiti, included the very phrase that Biassou had just written, that I just read to you. It says, they're going to live free or die to uphold the independence of Haiti to their last breath. And so there's been this long, frustrated and aborted effort to try to declare independence in Haiti and to write political documents that spell out everybody's equality, everybody's rights. For many years thereafter, Toussaint had already died in a prison in France, betrayed by France. Dessalines fought on. Civil war went on beyond that. So the desolation that we see today is a result not just of the slave revolt, but of the ongoing isolation that Haiti faced. The U.S. refused to represent or acknowledge Haiti. France also did. All of the Western world isolated Haiti and refused to deal with them for so long. And here they were struggling to recover from a terrible war with no outside exchange. And so it was many, many years thereafter before we finally recognized them. And we're only now starting to restore some of the historical reality of their own political ability and their own political dreams that were frustrated so many years ago, and that the reality of much of the misery that we're seeing on television and so on is a result of the terrible plantation systems that were imposed on them as well. So a combination of political oppression, economic devastation from the plantation system, the total unanimity of the Western world to isolate Haiti at the end of their revolution, all of this contributed to what the problems we see today. And I just wanted us to know that there had long been the same kinds of political inspiration and political interpretations and declarations that we now revere in our own country. We're always there for Haiti as well, but we don't see those images when we see what Colin describes on the screen. And so I think I just wanted you all to remember that that was a possibility, a frustrated possibility, and it still can be. So thank you.
afternoon. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for being here. My name is actually pronounced Jemima, Pierre, so just for clarification. I just came back actually from Haiti last night, so I have a lot of things in my mind, but I'm going to try and keep to my text. On February 18th this year, thousands of Haitians in the earthquake-ravaged city of Port-au-Prince demonstrated against the visit of Nicolas Sarkozy to the island. Paulette Joseph, one of the organizers of the protest, stated, "That's great," this is a quote, "That's great that Sarkozy has come to give France's support to the Haitian people in this difficult moment after the terrible earthquake that killed so many of our people and now forces us to live in greater misery. But $477 million doesn't even come close to the damage France inflicted upon Haiti before the earthquake. We were suffering from poverty before this crisis as a result of the debt Haiti was forced to pay the slave masters to recognize our independence. If our country is not equipped to handle this crisis, we are suffering more after the earthquake. It is a direct result of that debt," end quote. And recently, soon after the major donors conference last week where billions of dollars of reconstruction aid was promised, Haitians remain skeptical. Take, for example, this statement by a street vendor in Port-au-Prince, quote, "We want partnerships, people putting their hands with ours in the cassava pot to reconstruct our country. We don't want orders, we won't accept another slavery, we don't want dominion over us, we don't want to be turned into a protectorate. Partnerships, okay, but NGOs, that's non-government organizations, are coming and sucking the country. They're taking our money and sending it back to where they came from. They're taking our riches and making us poor." Now, the Sarkozy protest received very little coverage here, and much mass Haitian response to the international community has not gotten its deserved coverage. But I found these voices remarkable, primarily because they demonstrate that in the midst of disaster and devastation, and often desperation, Haitian people are clear about their needs, and particularly their priorities. It would have been easy to fall in line and not have a political protest when what was most needed at the moment was food and shelter. But this protest was a clear-headed response to the foreign aid community, and affirmed for me what those of us who take the time to speak to Haitian people on the ground know, that Haitian people should be at the forefront of their country's own recovery efforts. But this is a message that continues to ring hollow when we see the corporate media coverage of Haiti. Of course, the racist coverage of Haiti and Haitians, from the assumptions of savagery, I think we're all repeating the same thing, in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, to the absurd focus on Vaudin as the source of the country's predicament, is not new. But I think that what's at the core of this coverage is the age-old message of Haitians as children and capable of self-control, especially self-government. This message continues today when the focus is not exactly on the devastation, but the politics of rebuilding. Now, the stereotypes have shifted, and the focus is on the failed and corrupt state, once again reinforcing the same message of Haitians of being incapable of self-rule. Take, for example, U.S. Senator Chris Dodd's recent proposal to place Haiti under the trusteeship because the country is incapable, he said, of leading its own reconstruction. This call is not new, and it continues the most consistent theme of Western commentary on the island, that poor black people remain incapable of governing themselves. What this does, of course, is to prepare the ideological ground for the immediate U.S. and European intervention in Haiti. And the major media outlets in the past month have followed this directive in their stories. And from NPR to the Washington Post to the New York Times, there have been two sets of stories. One is about the inept Haitian government that does not deserve aid, and two is about how the recovery effort will and should be led by foreign and private contractors. What is left out of the reporting is the reality that it has been U.S. and other Western nations' policy since 2001 to bypass the Haitian government and direct their funds, aids, loans, to so-called private non-government agencies, and principally the USAID. Given the size and scope of international aid to Haiti, approximately 60% of the Haitian government's budget comes from external sources. This not only produces ineffective development programs, but also undercuts the very democratic process the US government says it wants to build. And since Haiti has been branded a failed state with a progress-resistant culture, according to David Brooks of the New York Times, of persistent want and poverty, the result is that white foreigners get to play prominent roles of delivering aid and being saviors to the Haitian people. Meanwhile, the countless Haitians, Haitian Americans, and others who are working hard on the ground remain virtually invisible. Recent statistics indicate that there are some 9,000 NGOs in the country of 9 million people, roughly one NGO per 1,000 people, the highest per capita concentration in the world. A Haitian NGO consultant that we spoke to on our visit claimed that 75% of US aid dollars supposedly aimed at development in Haiti goes back to the United States. According to the Associated Press, less than a penny of each dollar the US is spending on earthquake relief in Haiti is going in the form of cash to the Haitian government. Since President Obama announced the initial $100 million for Haiti earthquake relief, US government spending on the disaster has nearly quadrupled. But as the AP reports, each American dollar roughly breaks down like this: 42 cents for disaster assistance, 33 cents for US military aid, 9 cents for food, 9 cents for transportation for food, 5 cents for paying Haitian survivors for recovery effort, and less than 1 cent to the Haitian government, and about half a cent to the Dominican Republic. In my conversations with people during my 2 trips to Haiti since the earthquake, members of the Haitian community explicitly called out US-based NGOs that carry out most USA programs because they do not adequately consult or coordinate with local, regional, and national Haitian government authorities. Moreover, such agencies largely bypass relevant Haitian governmental entities, often putting resulting development projects at odds with stated national, regional, and local priorities. Given the coverage of Haiti and its people, it is easy to forget the neo-imperial context that this country has had to operate in over its 200-year existence. To me, Haiti has had other earthquakes, metaphorical ones, but ones no less important to understand its current situation. In 1804, Haiti achieved its freedom from France to become the world's first and only successful slave revolution. But freedom came at a price. The young republic's sovereignty was compromised in critical ways that continue to affect it today. After the 1804 revolution, Haiti was subject to a crippling economic embargo by France and the US. US sanctions lasted until 1863. France ultimately used its military power to force Haiti to pay reparations for the slaves that it lost. The reparations were 150 million francs. That's $20 billion in today's numbers. Now, to keep this in perspective, France sold the entire Louisiana territory for 80 million francs to the US. Haiti was forced to borrow money from banks in France and the US to pay these reparations, and Citibank was a big beneficiary in these interactions. The US occupied and ruled Haiti by force from 1915 to 1934. President Woodrow Wilson sent troops to invade in 1915. Revolts by Haitians were put down by the US military, which killed over 2,000 in one skirmish alone, 2,000 people. For the next 19 years, the US controlled customs in Haiti, collected taxes, ran many governmental organizations. From 1957 to 1986, Haiti was forced to live under US-backed dictators Papa Doc and Baby Doc Duvalier. The US supported these dictators economically and militarily because they did what the US wanted and were politically anti-communist. And it was just 6 years ago, in 2004, that US Marines landed in the Haitian National Palace and directed by gunpoint the country's elected president to a plane that sent him into exile, first to the Central African Republic and then to South Africa. In the chaotic aftermath, Haiti's prime minister was selected by Washington and imposed, as well as its Supreme Court justices and other key government officials. The UN then gave legitimacy to this coup d'etat and took over the occupation of Haiti, an occupation that has lasted 6 years and is still ongoing. For those who wonder why there are no Haitian government institutions to help with the earthquake relief efforts, this is a big reason. Or why there are 3 million people crowded in the area where the earthquake hit. US policy over the years has helped destroy Haitian agriculture, a fact that Bill Clinton admitted to as recently as 2 weeks ago. No, Haiti's history is not pretty, but we have to come to terms with the fact that it is a history of empire and domination, and an ongoing struggle for a people yearning to maintain its sovereignty and dignity in the face of unspeakable odds. And while the earthquake reveals the weakness of Haiti's infrastructure, it also lays bare Haiti's unequal engagement with the rest of the world. And we cannot understand Haiti's current predicament without linking it to the long history of an endless cycle of marginalization and occupation. And this is not to say, of course, that there are not forces within Haiti, particularly the economic elite, who work in concert with these international powers to maintain the same economic and political system of more for the few and less for the many. It is to remind us, however, that Haiti has never been left to its own devices. Its sovereignty has hardly been acknowledged, and this has everything to do with the direct legacy of slavery, revolution, and its aftermath. As we consider the human and social devastation in Haiti and recognize how it is deeply linked to the political devastation fostered by endless foreign meddling, and even as we laud the worldwide outpour of sympathy and support for Haitians, I hope that we pause to consider the 200+ years of unnatural disasters crippling these proud people. In Haiti, we visited most neighborhoods in Port-au-Prince, including community centers and orphanages, as well as two cities at the epicenter of the quake. The devastation was heartbreaking, but it was more than matched by what we found in the collective response of those on the ground. There are an estimated 1.5 million people without homes in the city who have been able to self-organize in order to respond to the crisis. People are living in hundreds of ad hoc camps. Many are administered by neighborhood committees that oversee food and water distribution, construction, sanitation, and security. We were particularly struck by the ways that members of communities erected makeshift roadblocks at night to protect those sleeping in the streets. We also found active community involvement in cleaning and rebuilding projects. We saw Haitian people helping each other. I recognize that this is not a common image here, and Haitian people on the ground recognize how they are viewed and represented. They are continuing to fight to assert their humanity and dignity, some of the things left in the face of such devastation and loss and dehumanizing treatment. An older woman pointedly told us, "We need people helping us who don't humiliate us." Her sentiments echoed over and over again during our days in Haiti by people who bristled at the continued representations of Haitians as helpless, corrupt, unorganized, and prone to violence. They were affirmed by the words of Patrick Elie, who stated, quote, "Haiti should not be pitied. It should be helped, not looked down upon, but probably looked at for some new lessons in solidarity, in discipline, and resilience." I find that these points of view are important to remember against the onslaught of incomprehensible yet normalized images and attendant predictable commentaries. These were not actions and words of a hopeless, backwards, and irredeemable group of people. And while it is important to admire the work of a range of groups committed to helping improve the lives of Haitians, I often worry about what these commitments to change lead us to believe about Haiti and its people, particularly when such commitments are not proposed neither in conversation with Haitian people nor with the intention to challenge the neo-colonial relationship that our US government has maintained with Haiti. While in Haiti and experiencing the new normal, the ways people continued making life as best they can in the aftermath of the earthquake, I often found myself advocating for a more banal discussion of the country, one that allows for its diversity of experience, its ups and downs, its simultaneous capacity for absurdity and grace, a Haiti about which one does not need to remind people that it is, in fact, just a place with people who work, who eat, who sleep, and who dream, like other human beings. It is, of course, a very special place with a layered history and equally complex people. But for those of us who are or hope to be involved in Haiti, we have to pause and find a place for reflection that might allow us to figure out what it means to act with Haiti as opposed to for Haiti, what it means to advocate for social justice and self-determination as opposed to supporting the status quo of foreign interference, and what it means to dispense compassion as opposed to pity, and finally, what it means to honor a free and proud people with respect and dignity. Thank you.
speaker. When you spoke of the definer, being sure what the definition is and who defines it, I thought of so much that has happened in terms of disaster and just what it shows when people have been disenfranchised. I'm speaking to Haiti. I thought of Katrina, and I thought of how the country media needed to depict them as refugees. And then, of course, I thought of African Americans inhuman. So I do so appreciate that analogy, that analysis you have, a truthful, honest look at that. What can we do in terms of making the media think like you? I know, that's another world, something. And then I have a question for her, it's not too much, is that okay?
Yeah, they'll give you really short answers.
Okay.
I'm thinking about CNN and Gupta and how I could somehow advise them. But I think it's a great question. There is, I'm sorry to say, I probably sound very pessimistic, but I don't think there's much to be done with the mainstream media, given that, as both speakers said, these representations are so much a part of a history of thinking about people we think of as different from ourselves. And quite frankly, at this point in our country, with things that are going on, the kinds of polarization, the kinds of hatred for people of color and people who are not seen as American, I think it's probably even harder to affect what the media is going to do because, of course, they want to sell newspapers and they want people to watch them on TV. I do think, however, what we can all do is to start using the internet because everything is available there and you do get other points of view. There are many sites now. Vanderbilt History Department has its own it's called Public Archive, and it gives you all you'd ever want to know about the history of Haiti and its people and what's happening now with tremendous links. So my only advice would be, well, screw the mainstream media and start really pursuing the internet.
Yeah, we're kind of with that. Yeah, we're on the same wavelength there. Thank you. And I think I did see something on the History Channel not too long ago about it and some of the things that you were saying in the middle. Pierre, you said NGOs, and someone else mentioned the NGOs were taking the largest percentage of the money, or they're running things where they can't. What can we do about that? We get politically involved, right? But what can we do about that? Because we don't want to just wait till disasters happen. We want to be, we should try to be humane, regardless of what our government is doing. What can we do?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. It's a difficult question to answer, actually, because, it's been U.S.'s policy to not even deal with these governments in the developing world and to go straight through their own international nonprofits, such as, the Red Cross, right? So everybody, and what was interesting is that everyone wanted to give after the earthquake, and people didn't know where to give. And that's been the most difficult thing even now. And part of that is because the NGO sector is so powerful in Haiti and in the developing world, and the international NGO sector, it marginalizes any local, any homegrown, small activist groups. And so they pick their favorite local NGOs to do, they hire them as contractors to do the underground work when all the money comes to them. So one thing would be to demand accountability from these NGOs that we're giving money to. to ask them where the money is being spent and demand that, they're working with local people. So the American Red Cross, for example, which raised so much money, only had 12 people on the ground before the earthquake. And they did not know anything about what was going on in Haiti. They did not have a clue of the local politics and the local culture. So we have to think about that when we give money, and to just demand accountability, and that's what I can think of. And maybe, we're working on a project of trying to list all the local NGOs, have a website where we can list local NGOs in Haiti where people can actually directly access them and directly donate to them.
Good, great. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lady in the middle here.
I have a question, and I'm trying to say in my mind, it makes all the sense in the world to try to donate to local organizations, but when the massive amount of money, because the media helped to make sure the message of need was there, the massive amount of money is funneling into a country. Is it practical when food is needed, security is needed, people are needed to be pulled out of the rubble, for us as donors to say, wait a minute, let me do my due diligence, Red Cross, make sure this goes to local people. Who are those local people? Are they buried in rubble? How do we practically do what you're saying?
That's a good point. I think you should keep giving. I also think, though, that accountability is needed, because people need food. People still need food today. And up until 12 days after the earthquake, the Red Cross was nowhere to be seen when I was driving around Haiti. And I was there. And the people we saw the most were, Doctors Without Borders, the Red Crescent, the Cuban and Bolivian doctors. And so those were the people we saw actually working in Haiti. And so then you have to ask yourself, and not only that, local people, these camps, these temporary camps, were already organized. And so when food was donated to a camp, they had community leaders that came and went around and determined what was the greatest need, how we're going to separate the little bit of food that we have for our little individual community. So local people were already doing that. They had already organized themselves. And so you could think about it like that. You could think about local NGOs having access directly to specific communities. And so if the aid comes to them, they know exactly the leaders to go to or the groups of community workers to go to actually help giving that aid. And that doesn't mean to stop giving to the Red Cross or to Doctors Without Borders, Partners in Health, but I do think it's something we need to think about.
And also, there are three very, very large, well-established grassroots, we call them grassroots organizations, but if you do go on the web, we're going to post those, so that one thing to do is maybe give money directly to these three places that are tried and true and known and have been working on the ground in Haiti for the last 20 years. So maybe it's more difficult to advise, I think, the American Red Cross, and I understand what you're saying. When you have such a vast campaign to get money on TV, how do you specify? How do you know where it's going? But maybe now is the time to make sure that some of the other places get direct aid. And so
You can also usually see most of the major ones will show you charts about how much goes to overhead and administration, and certainly you want to veer away from those that are top-heavy in that regard. So.
Well, just a quick follow-up. America is so good. Everyone always criticizes America, but it seems like nobody turns away our dollars. Whether it's in Indonesia, Tsunami, or whether it's, I think Americans are looking for how do we help, but how do we also not have to do our homework for every single country.
well, I'm going to have to.
When in Katrina, we're guilty of not even taking care of our own.
Your point is eloquent, actually. I mean, America does do so much, and there's so much money. I mean, it's incredible what's happened for Haiti. I think what we've been trying to say, however, is that very often that money raising, which is done so much with good intentions, and the people who are giving the money certainly have wonderful intentions. Americans have great intentions. I think what we're trying to say is that there was also governmental projects, U.S. governmental projects, corporate projects that end up having a lot of influence on the ground in Haiti. And then it gets taken away from the very aid that many of the Americans hoped it would be. And it gets taken away from those who were supposed to get it, those who most need it. And there certainly are many people in need. So.
Kind of running out of time here. Perhaps just one short question at the back there. I think we're going to then have to call it a day.
What were those three local NGOs?
Yeah, we're going to have those on the web.
And what are the three locals and what do they do? Do they provide instruction, help,
Well, there are tons of local organizations that work. There something called FOCAL, which focuses on women and children. There's Fondation Avenue, which is the organization that I work with, which focuses on young people and literacy. There are organizations for older people. There are rural organizations that work with farmers and trying to restart the agriculture sector. There's micro lending organizations. There are all kinds of things on the ground and that and part of that is, I guess, the need to put all of those in one place. But we don't get to see those, but they're there. And the thing I want to stress is, Haitian people have always they help people with the bare minimum. People are on the ground working and assisting one another, and that's important to remember because there's a tendency with the politics of aid to think that we need to go there and help these people. And there's something that reinforces, right? It reinforces the idea that people are not necessarily helping each other. They're doing the best that they can with what they have. And so we have to remember that there are people on the ground doing that. A lot of these organizations have been stifled because so much money has been going to the larger international nonprofits. And the politics of who gets aid and who gets foundation grants and so on and so forth really determine whether or not these local organizations survive or not. But there are people working.
Very last question in the corner.
Jemima.
I'm a Haitian native also, and I'm familiar with everything that's been going on. As far as last August, August I was in Haiti and in Jacmel, and currently what my grandmother's doing is opening her home. And her home is fine, her kitchen is fine, so we've just been sending money to her, sending food to her. And sometimes you just have to find that family in the neighborhood that's actually helping. Because one of the problems they're having in Jacmel is women and girls are getting raped left and right. So what we've actually been doing is getting tents for ourselves and just sending it. It doesn't matter what the cost is, put tents together and send it out there and try to help the women and the children. But I understand, I didn't donate to the Red Cross because I know people that work with the Red Cross, and sometimes the funds doesn't even get to the right places. And right now the Red Cross is so overwhelmed with earthquakes everywhere, so it's just allocating the amount of people in different places and funds in different places. It's very hard. It's very hard to determine exactly where you want your funds to go to and what you want your funds to go for. So if you want to do something, I always say, go to your local churches and start a missionary group and get on the ground and do it yourself, because that doesn't necessarily, when you go through the bigger companies, it doesn't mean that the money is actually going to the right place.
Thanks very much. Are there any comments you'd like to make? Well, then I think we should just thank our